Today I'm joined by author and podcaster Zachary Elwood. And I am really interested in your work on depolarization and the feedback loop of dehumanization and depolarization that takes over when we start to see other people as us and them, when we start to think in terms of us and them. And so I'm really excited to have the chance to speak with you and hear your thoughts and how this perspective has evolved for you, and what your suggestions are for what we can do to see people as human beings rather than representatives of opposing ideologies. So thank you for being with me today, Zach. And would you mind maybe setting up a little bit of your background and how you came to be involved in this?
Sure. Try to give a long story short. So I had well, I guess the journey, you could say, began when Trump was elected. I was somebody who was posting a lot of insulting things about Trump voters on social media, and basically saying things like, "Oh, you failed a basic moral test," and insulting people in that way. And started thinking about it and seeing myself, started seeing oh, I'm part of the way that conflict grows. Started seeing my role in the conflict dynamics. And I've had a psychology behavior podcast, People Who Read People, that I've done, since around 2017. It started out as about reading people, reading behaviors and behavior focus. But then I started getting interested in polarization and how conflict grows, and examining, how divides have happened in other countries and throughout history, and seeing the basic human kind of dynamics at work, no matter what the issues are. Conflict kind of progresses in a very similar way, an underlying related to underlying human psychology. So I started interviewing people about that, and how, for example, one of the people I first interviewed was Jennifer Lynn McCoy, who studies polarization and conflict in various countries. So I just started getting curious and started seeing my own role, and started seeing the role of how liberals have contributed to the divides, and reading books about that by Richard Rorty and Mark Lilla, and seeing those perspectives. And so that just led to me, culminated in me writing the book Defusing American Anger, which was kind of my way to try to sum up things I'd learned. And yeah, that's kind of the long story short of it. Yeah.
So it sounds like you were already talking about these things and aware of these dynamics, and then you woke up to a blind spot in yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't somebody who, I was liberal leaning before the election, but I wasn't somebody who paid a lot of attention to politics. And then, it was kind of like a lot of people, it was Trump got elected. It's on the left and the right, and it got a lot of attention, and, people are angry and surprised. And I started getting curious about how, what the reasons are for people why they voted for Trump, and seeing how the us versus them animosity on both sides had been increasing leading up to that for several decades, and basically just being curious about how that happens, and also seeing that nobody's going to help us get out of this. It's I used to kind of rely on this idea that oh, there's some people in charge somewhere who will solve things for us, even in an unexamined way. It wasn't that was a conscious thought, but I kind of was it's not up to me, it's up to these people who are in charge. But the more I thought about it, I was well, the system, the incentives, once a group enters a conflict, the incentives and the way the system works just naturally pre-select for people behaving in more polarizing ways. So I don't see, the system or the people that are in power helping us much in that regards, because just kind of the nature of conflict, an angry mass of people want people who are angry and aligned with their anger. So there's some fundamental systemic things at work there. So I started saying well, it's up to us, the people, to work on this, because nobody's going to get us out of this. If we're going to get out of it, all of us need to take our responsibilities more seriously about how we all contribute to these dehumanization cycles.
When you describe that sort of awakening, that curiosity that you had around Trump, that I kind of remember it similarly for me. I was a Democrat voter, didn't like him, was swept up in the rhetoric around him. And at some point, although I didn't start loving the guy, it's not like I've a switch flipped and I'm suddenly like, oh, I love Trump. It was just he just didn't seem like the boogeyman that they had made him out to be. And not only that, but even more, it was that the voters, I couldn't wrap my head around how we were talking about other people in quite such a dehumanizing way. Like that was where it sort of jumped the shark for me. Was I don't think that half the country, although I haven't agreed or had not at that point, I could have said, I don't agree with Republican policies. I would have firmly said that. I didn't think that Republicans were terrible people. I thought that they were wrong about some things. And so when I was in graduate school and I'm in a counseling program where we're talking about Trump voters and we use this language, I had a professor tell me that we know we're not training future counselors who are going to be able to work with the Trump voter. And so it was this whole class of people that are just invalid and inhuman. Mm-hmm. And that's where I started to, it really jumped the shark. And it's like, I don't know. I think about Rwanda and I think about this drumming up of the language around the Hutus and the Tutsis and this absolute degradation of the other side. And it felt like we didn't boil the frog slow enough, if that's what we were doing. They turned up the heat really fast. And I think a lot of liberals and former Democrat voters woke up to that around that same time.
Yeah, and I talk about that in my book. It's like, I think, Trump clearly, whatever your political opinions, it's like he clearly was a factor in, or anger ramping up. And it's like, I examine that kind of dynamic in my book because I think the amount of nuance there, the simplistic take of like, Trump was the one who, Trump was responsible for, these liberal side kind of simplistic views of like it's Trump's fault and everybody who supports Trump is just like Trump, or these kind of simplistic views. It's like it's very easy to examine, like for a lot of, for example, a lot of people just, I really do think for the election, it was kind of a perfect storm in that, there was so much baggage against Hillary Clinton. I think literally anybody else would have been elected except for Trump if they had ran against Trump. But anyway, I think my larger point is examining how these things have a cascading effect. It's like Trump gets elected. For a lot of people, they were just voting for him because he was a Republican candidate. There wasn't, we could point at like the white nationalists or the extremists who voted for him. Even if we have the worst case view of like his early support, which I've written some about that, but it's like, for a lot of people, they just didn't want to vote for the Democrat. Like it was that simple. And that, you look at the patterns, it was like a lot of the voting patterns were just like a standard election. Mm-hmm. So, Trump gets elected. Liberals are like, oh, this must really represent a horrible thing. Like all these people are racist, et cetera, misogynist, whatever it is. They take the worst case framing for what the event meant, where instead of seeing like, our us versus them animosity has been increasing for decades. B, a lot of people had some populist discontent with the system that was very similar to like Bernie Sanders' side discontent with the system. C, a lot of people were just voting Republican. Like doesn't mean they're the same as the white nationalists or whatever. It's like, but for a lot of people, they just kind of saw what they wanted to see. And that includes, like you said, taking some really worst case, extremely pessimistic things of what Trump said. For example, the Mexican rapist comment, which is like, a lot of people will point to that, like clearly Trump is racist because he said that, but it's like you examine the nuance and it's like you can find Mexican American Trump voters who were like, he clearly didn't mean all Mexicans. He was talking about criminals coming into the country and he wasn't speaking denigrating all Mexicans. So, and I examine that in my book. It's like these very divergent views that we can have. And I can understand, as somebody who started out insulting Trump voters and being very angry. I mean, I can see both sides, and that's kind of what my curiosity led me to try to see both sides. It's like I can see why people, I see why people very much dislike Trump. I very much dislike him. I think he's very divisive, apart from his political stances. Like that part of it is unrelated to his political stances. And I also see why people discontented with the system in various ways, non-racist people, compassionate and rational people could have, would have voted for him, or even think, very much aligned with him. And I see both of those things, and I think it so much comes down to this general conflict dynamic where it's like both sides are just start filtering the other side through the worst possible lens, which amps up, both sides' animosity, which makes both sides create more and more pessimistic framings or narratives about the other side. And so it just has this vicious cycle aspect. And to me, a big part of how we unwind that is getting people to be curious and try to understand, like, well, how can these two realities be so divergent, right? Like, how can we find ourselves on the opposite side of these chasms on various things, not just on, and that's the thing too, is like, when we talk about the nuance of like, who's liberal, conservative, like that, even these words are so simplistic, it's like when we get into these conflicts, things are so complex and the system is so turbulent and unstable. It's like, those labels kind of break down too. It just largely becomes about, I'm angry at those people. Like it kind of like loses a sense of like, what is it we're even actually fighting about? And, can we take on a issue by issue basis and reach a compromise? It just becomes about like, they're horrible. I don't like what they're doing. I hate them,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like a flattening down of the other side, so to speak, to this caricature, and sort of a forced teaming with the worst aspects of what you perceive them to be. Everybody is lumped into one. And I know I'd like to hear how you process the move out of the left and right paradigm, out of that mental, how you made that shift. And not to belabor the point about the Democrats and Republicans, but one of the things that really jarred me, and one of what kind of awakening moments for me out of this left-right paradigm, was really something that you described. I thought, I know I voted for the Democrat in that round, and I didn't like Hillary. I had watched what happened with the DNC and Bernie Sanders, and I thought Hillary was completely crooked in that whole deal, and I was really upset about it because I was a Bernie fan. I really liked him in that election cycle a lot. And when we all witnessed what went down with the DNC, I was disgusted with Hillary. And yet I was a Democrat voter, and I voted for the Democrat candidate. And so I fully had this awareness that on the other side of the aisle, there are Republican voters who vote for the Republican candidate. And whatever, even if we had painted this picture of Trump as literally Hitler, I didn't think Hillary was a good actor at all. And she got my vote. So I just had a solid awareness that people are going to vote on party lines, and that it doesn't, even if I thought Trump was this horrible guy, which at the time I kind of did, I was aware
you're voting
that
against, you're voting more against than for. Yeah.
And so the other side was going to do the same thing. And so it wasn't like every single person is equivalent to the worst thing about their candidate.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a hugely important and unexamined part of these things. It's like, the thing I see on both sides is like, these people are voting for X candidate. They must fully support everything about them, right? I mean, that's really the mistake, is like you described. It's like, many people are simply voting against the other side. It doesn't mean,
right.
The things that comes to mind for me is people I know, liberal people I know, were like, how could Trump voters support what Tommy Tuberville said, like this, racist comment, that many people perceived as racist, about like Black people are committing the crime or whatever he said. And it's like, to me, it's very easy to understand because, even for example, a Black Trump voter would see that and be like, okay, yeah, I really think that was wrong, but I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the things I don't like on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, when you feel like you're in a war, you're not really focused on like, hey, some people in your group did a bad thing. You're much more focused on the threat you see from the other side. And I think understanding that dynamic really helps us understand like the kind of futility of like everybody always being like, how can you support this random thing that somebody on that side did? It's like, that's not how the conflict works. They're not focused on the things that you're focused on, and they don't think that those things are that meaningful, because they'll just be like, well, yeah, there are some bad people on my side, or they said some bad things, but it's like, that's really not my focus. I'm focused on the badness of the other side.
Yeah, it also seems like this is maybe a manifestation of the fundamental attribution error, which, the psychological phenomenon by which we tend to attribute problems with others to their character and problems that with us to our circumstances. And so we'll see more nuance in our side, but somebody else, like if I'm driving down the road like a bat out of hell, I'm late. I'm really late for something very important and I have to get there. And I don't normally do this, but I'm going to give myself a pass. But somebody else driving down the road, he's just a complete jerk. He's just,
totally
no care for human life.
Yeah, and that's a huge part of it. It's like, and the more maybe like layman term or layman way to describe it is like, we just are super generous to people who either ourselves or people like us who we perceive as on our side. We're like, we'll cut them a break, or we view our side as very diverse and human, and we view the other side as this monolith of all as bad as the worst people on that side. And we, like you say, we are very ungenerous with them. We'll view them through the most pessimistic lens and not give them a break for anything they say, or, so I think that there's these kind of like fundamental, group versus group human psychology things that play out that, many people have examined, the outgroup homogeneity effect, which is like, you see the other group in a conflict is like all the same. You see that a lot on both sides, where it's like painting the other side as like all as extreme as the most extreme people in that group, or as angry and hateful as the most angry and hateful people in that group. You see that a lot. That's kind of a fundamental thing. But yeah, the thing you mentioned is huge. Like we just, how we cut people slack, and when we do is very biased.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing to examine in ourselves and to become aware of ourselves doing. Do you so what's your process moving out of that left and right for yourself personally, when you started to wake up to realizing that you're doing that very thing?
Yeah, I think it was I think it came from my interest in psychology, of just understanding, why people are thinking how they do. And I won't say I was ever like, super, I never really associated myself like very much with the labels of Democrat or liberal or any of these things. I was just largely in a liberal sphere, and largely had, liberal associated thoughts. But I think, the path out of these things, and I think I will say too, like one of the ways I try to overcome people's objection to the depolarization, reducing us versus them anger ideas, is that I will say, you can continue thinking one side is much worse while examining the ways that we or our group or whatever contribute to these divides. And I think that's very important, because the biggest objection you'll get is like, you're saying both sides are the same, or whatever. You're saying we can't be politically passionate or upset, and then that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just trying to highlight like the complexity of the divides and how many of us how we can contribute to the divides. And that's, you can do that and try to lower the animosity and contempt while fully believing like the other side is very bad. And that's one of the things I focus on. It's like, I think that overcomes a lot of objections from what I've seen, and gets people more into the funnel of like, how can we help with this, even if we are very, very scared of the other side, right?
So it's more an awareness of a conflict process that we're contributing to, rather than addressing any of the content of the argument. So you can still hold on to your objections to what someone else or some other group is doing, and feel very strongly about why you object to that. Mm-hmm. But it's recognizing your human nature in this process that you're contributing to.
Yeah, it's like, I think that is what gives people, the recognition that like, yes, I can be very upset, about this transgender issue. I can be very angry even, but it's like recognizing like that's one dimension, like how we actually feel about the issues, right? But then it's like this meta level thing of like how we engage with each other, which is like, and the thing I try to focus on is like how we engage with each other when we disagree and when we're angry can be what creates the very things we're angry about, right? So it like feeds back into the issues, you can create the very pushback and anger that actually bothers you, right? And I think that's what the main thing that people don't see when they're fighting these culture war things, or the things that they're politically passionate about. It's like, how we engage with each other is not some like side thing. It's exactly what drives back into the very anger that gets created that we're angry about, right? It's like we can be unintentionally helping create the very things that bother us, right? It's like, for example, we saw this with Trump, where it's like, some of the ways Trump spoke, the aggressive ways that, even his own supporters will say, yes, he spoke very aggressively and belligerently. And that's what many people liked about him. But it's like, we can see that can create a pushback, where it's like, you saw a big sign up in Democrat socialist, or you saw people's immigration views shift. And like, some people might say like, well, that's, liberal reactions causing that. But it's also like, you can imagine a less polarizing, more persuasive version of Trump who wouldn't create that pushback, right? And it's like, the more you approach these things with a divisive framing, the more pushback you're going to create to your very ideas, which is kind of gets to me at like something I often emphasize too. It's like, the conflict resolution ideas are not like just something we do to get along. They're actually like the most politically persuasive ideas. Like, if you care about something, you're not going to persuade people by insulting them and telling them they're morally bankrupt, right? You're going to persuade them by speaking to their more rational objections and calmly saying like, can you see my point of view when I frame it in the most persuasive way? So to me, the attempts, to achieve a political goal and the conflict resolution things are completely aligned. Like, but I think in many people's eyes, they see them as like mutually exclusive. But to me, it's like, otherwise, if you take the divisive approaches, you just create this like very dysfunctional landscape where like the policies are swinging every few years between these like extreme poles, and it's like an unstable seesaw almost. The worst case scenarios are, civil war or something, but there's lesser things where just all the things are out of whack, and you go back and forth between these kind of extreme fights between both sides, and you're not actually achieving what you want to achieve in a stable way. You're just creating kind of a lose-lose place where everything's really unstable. And so I think, letting politically passionate people see that these can be really powerful tools. And it's almost, to me, like, who's going to use the tools of persuasion more effectively? Like, because I see on both sides of any issue, I can imagine people winning over just a few percent more of people and decisively, winning elections if they were able to do that. So I see it as very politically powerful tools when they're used right.
Well, and I want to hear more about the tools that you're talking about, and also the sort of the pattern as you see it playing out in an unchecked, unaware conflict cycle, where you're not aware of using this inflammatory process to argue your point, and then also a more ideal version of what a conflict cycle could look like. As you're talking about this, like this inflammatory language, and use Trump as an example, what I picture is somebody's coming in and using these bombastic rhetorical techniques. It creates a kind of a bimodal escalation, because you've got the people who are behind this guy's speech and like what they're hearing, and they get pumped up. And then you have the other side that's triggered by this and frustrated and has this knee-jerk reaction to this, and they're getting pumped up. So you end up like furthering this divide in a way that escalates both sides and ratchets things up. And I wonder about why are people drawn to that? Why do you have thoughts on that, or have you studied that? Why are people why do they want to get inflamed for their cause? Why do people find that passion and get so roused and seem to like really want to get pumped up about a fight that they want to fight?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, I think some of it can be tied to like the modern landscape of us being more isolated from each other. And, I talked about this in one of the podcast episodes I did about, people have written a lot about the isolation of modern life. We're more online. We have less social connections. We do less community oriented things together. And I think some of that existential isolation, goes into like, well, how am I going to find meaning? Like, there's a big fight over here that I can feel like I can get my meaning from this big fight that's happening. But also from the other side, it's like, I also get that there are things that are very important to us that we can very much disagree on. So, for people that do feel that way, I understand that too about various issues. Like, we can feel that there's something very bad happening. And it's like both of those things can kind of be true, like understanding how people want to find meaning in these bigger divides and recognizing that there's real serious things that we disagree over. And I bring it back to like the passion. I don't think the passion is the problem, because I think a more healthy version, or a culturally healthier version of our divides looks like, getting to the conflict resolution principle of being hard on ideas but soft on people, right? It's like we could speak in ways that point out the bad things we see, the bad ideas we see, and focus on the ideas and less focus on like, these people are bad and horrible for having these ideas. And then that's actually a more persuasive way to make your case, is like talk about like criticize the idea. And the more you focus on the people and their badness, the more you're going to create the very pushback that you don't like. So I do think there are ways to arouse passion, because I think that's kind of a mistaken thing I see in a lot of political operators' ways of thinking about things. It's like, well, we need that passion to fundraise or like get votes out. And it's like, well, no, you don't need to call people morons and evil or whatever it is you're doing to get your point across. And it's like being willing to examine the divisiveness of your approaches, and like some of the people on your side's inability to even have a discussion, right? It's like being willing to examine that is very important, I think. And that's why I do think, I think a lot about like what would more persuasive versions of people's arguments on both sides look like. I think a lot about that, while they can also, achieve passion and get turnout and stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, I like on the website for your book, there's a graphic for a polarization feedback loop that you did. And I think that describes a simple pattern that is really easy to grasp. And would you mind whether it's that graphic or whether you have a different pattern in your mind, could you kind of give a description of what the problematic conflict process is as you see it happening in terms of pattern?
Yeah. So that was a graphic I made just because I think it's a general kind of conflict concept. I don't want to give the idea that I came up with the concept, but I hadn't seen a good diagram kind of showing in an easy way how it works. And so the diagram I put together was basically like, we speak about the people in a conflict. One group speaks about the other side in a more insulting and demeaning and angry way. That creates people on the other side who sees our group as more dangerous and more immoral. They have lower and lower opinions of us. They become more likely to speak in more insulting and dehumanizing and demeaning ways. That makes us see them as more immoral and more dangerous. We speak about them in more insulting and demeaning ways. So it's just this kind of vicious cycle that gets at kind of the fundamental aspect of conflict. And, that conflict can play out with all sorts of different issues. I think the kind of like blinkered or narrow view that many people have when they're in a conflict, they can feel like this conflict is very special or unique to us. It's like, this is a very distinctly American Republican Democrat conflict. Whereas like, if you start looking at how conflicts play out in so many ways, that's really, this underlying dynamic of how it plays out with different issues. And I think part of getting people to see this and help with it is getting them to see this kind of like a higher level view of how the conflict occurs, and allowing us to see the main contributors to it, And I think, for me, I focused more on the liberal side contributions, because I think that's less examined, and because the mainstream is so liberal dominated. So there's more of blind spots about like people being like, well, how can you say that liberals contribute? It's like, but they're, progressive people have written entire books about how liberals contribute to our divides, which, drawing attention to some of those things can bring people's attention to, like, okay, you might think, for example, you might think Republicans are worse, but can you examine the reasons that have contributed to the things that, that they're angry about and how the conflict progresses, right? That to me is very important because, that's kind of how I see some of the value I'm bringing, because I just think that a lot of people are just afraid to talk about that on the liberal side. And I feel like being more in that world, I can talk to those people, and I want to talk about that, because we can really only change people that are kind of politically similar to us. Like a conservative couldn't come in and say, somebody who's hardcore conservative couldn't write the book I could, speaking to a more liberal audience, right? And I would like, I ask people in the book, it's like, hey, maybe conservatives who like this book would be willing to do a similar thing on their side. And I actually know a couple of people in the conservative world who are interested in that. Like we've talked about, like, well, what would a version of this book look like, from a conservative angle for people who are politically passionate on those kinds of topics. And so to me, it's like, it's just about more people talking about the problem, however they do it. It's like, if we can at least align on, no matter our political viewpoints, we can at least align on how the conflicts get really bad. And, then we can just disagree. Like somebody put it, Andrew Mouser, who a conservative person I talked to who was interested in these concepts, he's like, can't we just disagree like adults? Can't we just, if we're always going to fight each other on various things like we clearly are, can we just disagree like adults, basically, and do it maturely?
I think the thing that's really brilliant about this is how it scales. It scales up and down, because the same underlying processes at work in even in marriages that are where people struggle. And, you've brought it up to the national level or the political level, but it kind of is this underlying circuit that can happen often. And one of the things, I don't know, maybe this is too far afield, but I wonder if, when you say, can we just disagree like adults? I thought about there's the whole cluster B hypothesis that Josh Slocum has talked about and Chris Rufo just wrote about. And we're talking about people who are experiencing or examining the fact that at the population level, more people are having difficulty with emotional regulation, which maybe this is just too far afield, but something I thought of is, if we have a slide into less mature conflict dynamics in general, would we not expect to see more of this kind of thing happening? And could that explain some of the extreme polarization we've been experiencing?
Yeah. And I have a few episodes kind of getting back to that, kind of the more existential and psychological, factors in this. Cause I see some of these things as kind of a self-reinforcing dynamic. It's like, if some of the factors in our culture, as examined in like Jonathan Haidt's, the coddling of the American mind, if some of those factors could be influencing polarization, making it worse, but then again, polarization could be influencing, the conflict itself could be making people more emotional and more prone to, these kind of immature ways of dealing with disagreement, right? So I think for a lot of these things, it's such a complex dynamic, because the things people will point out as factors, it's like, yes, some of those may be factors, probably, many factors involved, but it's also like the very nature of conflict can exacerbate lots of those factors themselves. And so there can be this big feedback mechanism, which I think, is kind of like a lot of people try to look for these magic bullet kind of things. It's like, oh, I found the main factor, but it's like I think just the human nature of conflict is just such an all-encompassing thing. It can draw in all these other things into the conflict and make us behave in weird, unreasonable ways where we're like, how could somebody say that? Like, why would they do that? It makes no sense. And it's like, we're dealing with something so intrinsically human deep inside us that's being triggered and makes us behave in these really unreasonable ways on such a broad scale, at least that's how I see it.
Well, so with that picture of a dysfunctional or escalating conflict cycle, I guess, maybe not dysfunctional, but just an escalating conflict cycle, what are some suggestions for how we can, like, if you wake up to the fact that you've been participating in this and you want to do things differently, how can you do things differently while still maintaining your positions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I focus on that a little bit at the end of my book, where it's like, what do we do about this? Like for people who do see the problem, as I've hopefully persuaded them to see it. I think, a big part of it is trying to take, a big part of it is focusing on that like hard on ideas, soft on people idea, which can allow you to criticize whatever you want to criticize and even criticize specific people as long as you're not like insulting the entire other group, right? It's like I never feel, barred from criticizing ideas or criticizing people. I often do, but it's like how we do it. And it's trying to remember that like even for your own benefit, it's like you're not doing this to, just be nice or get along. It's like these things actually help you make more persuasive arguments, so for people that are passionate, that's one way to see it. And then B, I think for people that are, see the problem of increasing conflict and want to help with that, it's like taking a longer term perspective of how we overcome these things and recognizing that we're prone to like overly focusing on these immediate outrages of the day and trying to see it more longer term. It's like, well, yeah, the nature of conflict is that people on both sides are going to do, some people on both sides are going to do increasingly unreasonable and dumb and weird and, even violent things. But it's recognizing how like both sides are going to take, we have a tendency to take those things and work them into our like existing us versus them narrative. So I think part of it is like trying to take a step back and see the landscape of the problem and be like, am I overreacting to something that like, am I contributing by overreacting to something that's fairly rare, right? It's like, what does it mean that like this X horrible thing happened? Does it really tell us something about the horribleness of the other side in a nation of 300 million people, right? It's like taking a step back and thinking like, well, if I care about, A, achieving my political goals or B, reducing the animosity, it's like, let's take a step back and think about, well, what am I actually doing? Like if I post on social media, like, am I actually, if I'm venting about something I hate, am I actually doing anything? Am I actually like achieving anything? Or am I just like adding to the noise of animosity, of like just angering other people or getting people worked up about something that's, I think that about that a lot. I mean, I see so many people online, across the political spectrum where their use of social media is just venting things, they hate or venting things they're angry about. It's like, and I think for a lot of these people, they think that they're doing something useful and paying attention or being aware. And it's like, I would get people to question like, how are you actually using your time? Are you actually achieving anything? Or would you be better off like volunteering for some local cause where you felt like you were doing something good, for your community or whatever it is. So I think it's about this self-examination of like, what am I actually doing? Am I just creating more animosity? Am I feeding into things? So I think both of those things, it's like, yeah, examining our language and how it can be overly increasing in animosity, and then just questioning how we're spending our time and our attention. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So refining and examining our goals and our actual behavior in relation to our goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
Perspective taking.
Mm-hmm. It's hard work. I mean, I think, and if anyone's curious, like I assembled a bunch of books on my American Anger website from looking at the problem from different angles. There's a lot of books out there. So if people don't want to read my book, there's plenty of other books, and it's american-anger.com. But I think getting curious about the problem is a big part of it. It's just like, because you're not going to do the other things unless you're kind of curious about like how conflicts play out and why that's a bad thing. So I think, yeah, even just exposing the nature of the problem is a big part of getting people to even care why they should care.
What kind of reception have you gotten since you've started talking about this topic specifically? And do you find that there's a lot of, are there a lot of people who are ready to start thinking this way and start engaging in a different way on issues that they're concerned about?
Yeah, I think there is a big demand out there. I think a lot of people, even the very politically passionate people, can say that yes, the us versus them animosity and contempt is out of hand. So I think there is a big demand for that. I think the thing I've seen is like people are curious about the ideas, but they are like, well, how is that possible? Because I'm very angry about stuff. So I think part of it, I've seen a lot of people interested in these things and have gotten a lot of good feedback. And I think a big part of it is trying to make the case to people, why they can think what the path is, basically, even while you're very angry about various issues, seeing what that path is. So yeah, I have seen a lot of people, like I get a good amount of responses. I've gotten a lot of followers on Twitter over the years just from going in various threads, very angry threads, and posting, kind of depolarizing ideas and different viewpoints. And I've had a lot of productive conversations with academics in the field who study the nature of conflict and have shown me a lot of support for the things I've said. So yeah, I think that the demand is there for people. And then that's one reason I say, like, we just need more people thinking about it and talking about it, however they approach it. It's like, it's just kind of a lot not well known set of concepts, because there's so many like common objections to it, that we need to overcome, I think.
Mm-hmm. I have talked with more, well, I guess since I've sort of pulled back from this left right kind of thinking, which for me occurred over the last several years. And I watched this whole Walkway movement happen with people who had become dissatisfied with left-wing politics, but still felt like they were more left of center. I've talked with, excuse me, more conservative people, probably, but than I probably had before. But I've also stopped really thinking in terms of left and right as much. But it's interesting to sort of see the feedback that I've gotten about politics, like comments on the channel and stuff. It's the people who there's people at different stages, it seems, of being dissatisfied with the way the politics are being done on the left, with feeling like the left has gone too far. And it seems like a very common thing for liberals or left-wing people to kind of give their liberal cred as they are coming out with their arguments. They're really trying to make a case that I am somebody who's always been on the left. I really am. I'm not the other side. I'm one of the good guys. I'm one of the good guys. So yeah, please listen to what I have to say. And I really, that's something I kind of have struggled to not do. I don't want to do that because I don't want to engage on that level anymore. I could do that, but I don't really want to. But it's really interesting how a lot of this seems to be happening with people who are left of center, but feel like the left went way too far.
And you can find, there's many people that talk about that. I mean, political and quite, left-leaning political experts of various sorts, like Francis Fukuyama talks about that, seeing, getting back to like seeing how the left contributes to our divides and does divisive things. And I think one of the important things I didn't mention is, like, for the people that do feel kind of like politically homeless, I've talked to a lot of those people. I think part of the effort of reducing this conflict is getting those people to feel more empowered and to see the value that they can bring to the table. Because I think what happens to a lot of those people is they kind of like drop out. They get frustrated. They're like, I'm just not going to pay attention, because, they'll say things like, well, everybody's crazy now. I'm just not going to pay attention. But I think part of that is making those people who are less tribal in nature, see the value that they can bring, and they can play an important role in this kind of work, where they can bring, like, hey, I'm going to try to talk people down, not about their beliefs, but about how they engage with people, and the insults and the contempt. And it's like, I think those people are more likely to be valuable as more like, kind of mediators or middle of the road kind of people who, and I think we need to empower those people more and make them feel like, hey, there's a patriotic or however you want to frame it, a good role that you can play that helps people and helps the country and helps us avoid worst case scenarios, is making, because like you say, a lot of people I think the labels just fundamentally mean less and less the more, even in the best of times, like the most stable of times, those labels were kind of like rough to begin with. You can read this book by the Lewis brothers. It's called like the myth of left and right or something like that. It talks about the kind of like nuance behind these kind of simplistic labels we use, and those things kind of break down more and more the more turbulent a society becomes. So yeah, I think that encouraging that audience is important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like a large part of the core of this breaking this conflict polarization feedback loop is just recognizing that you don't need to be so brutally dehumanizing to other people in order to get your point across. You can talk to people like adults and state your and respect their position while stating your own. And it's just pulling back from that escalation cycle, but while not giving up your position.
Yeah, I think so. I think getting people to see more of that, and even if they want to criticize things harshly, it's like, hey, this idea is very, very stupid, and here's why. Like, that's better than saying these people are very stupid, right? It's like, yeah. So it is really about, to me, so much of it comes back to language. Whereas I think for a lot of people, they see language as like this side thing of like, for me, it's like language is like the fundamental way we, interact. It's the fundamental way we form stories. It's the fundamental way we create the pushback or, how we interact with people. So to me, the language is key to it.
And how would you communicate with someone who is really emotional about their side? How do you get across to someone, or do you?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, at some level, I used to have a lot of pointless fights online, and at some level, you just got to be like getting back to the idea of like, how am I spending my time? Like, what am I actually accomplishing? Like, what are my chances of actually having an actual, meaningful conversation with this random person online, or whoever, even somebody I know online, because online's like the worst way to talk to somebody. So, getting to that level of like seeing, well, what am I actually doing? Am I wasting my time? Is this person just going to keep insulting me? There's no point in me engaging with them, and trying to also keep in mind, like, this person doesn't represent the entire other side, right? Like, there's many people on the other side of whichever side that will engage with you in more respectful and considerate ways. So it's like, you have to also remind yourself, like, this random encounter I'm having with whoever doesn't actually mean much in the big scheme of things, right? Like, or it doesn't necessarily mean much. It doesn't represent people necessarily. So.
And what do you hope to see from this work that you've been doing? What is your personal hope for what happens next?
Well, yeah, people might get the idea that I'm like optimistic or something. I'm actually kind of pessimistic about how things will go, but I do think, like, if we're going to change things, I do think it requires more people to hear these ideas. And so, and I'm not the only person working on these kind of things. There's whole organizations like Braver Angels and Starts With Us and a host of other organizations and people. So it's like, I see my role as just helping bring these ideas, one of many people to bring these ideas to different pockets of people. And, if we do the work well, it just means we're going to see a shift in the culture. We'll still disagree and fight over things, but it will be disagreeing in a way that doesn't dehumanize. We'll be disagreeing, and I really do believe this is a existential threat, not just to America, but to humanity, because you factor in, like, we're going to create more and more powerful weapons. So, one of these days, we're going to create, the ability to create man-made diseases in your basement is going to be easier and easier. So all it will take is like one really antisocial person to do a huge amount of harm. So you factor that in, and it's like, we're really at some kind of cusp of like, I just think there's a good likelihood we wipe ourselves out in a few decades, or, just with that factor. And so I really do think, like, trying to get over the fundamental tendency for humans to hate each other and fight each other is kind of like what we need to do to survive long term. Like, I see that as much more a threat than like AI and all these things that people talk about, or climate change. I feel like much more direct a threat is like our fundamental tendency to hate each other, you know?
Mhm.
So yeah, that's how I view it.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, so with that in mind, it's just incumbent on each person to try to overcome that to the extent that they can.
Yeah, and look for opportunities to do what they can, you know, and to spread those ideas in whatever way. I think there's many ways. I mean, one thing I'd like to see is more entertainment media, you know, like fictional things. You know, the fictional world is, or entertainment and creative world is so polarized with so many liberals being in those spaces. It's like, but imagine what it would look like if we saw more kind of bridge building or empathy building political works in the entertainment space, and like how that would change the dialogue and like change people's empathy and help them see like, oh, you know, as opposed to like what we currently see, which is like just a lot of dunking on people that disagree with us in the liberal, you know, entertainment space. I just think that's a big part of moving the needle too. And there, you know, I saw the other day there was this Bridge Entertainment Group, which was a nonprofit dedicated to trying to create more entertainment-driven bridge building narratives. So I mean, stuff like that is, I think, a big part of changing the culture too. It's like, and I think people are ready for it. I mean, I talk to people on both sides of the divides who are like, yes, to change the culture, you know, we can imagine all these things, and I think more and more people are ready for those things. Like there's less judgment. You know, we were at our peak of probably our peak theoretically of animosity during, you know, COVID and the George Floyd things and such. And I think we've like taken it down a little bit from there, but there's a chance it could go up again. But I think there's a window of at least an opportunity where many people are receptive to these ideas now, even if they may not know, you know, how they may have major objections in various ways to them. But it's like, if we can overcome those objections, then we can get people to see the value and start these culture changing things. Because I really do think, you know, research shows it's much easier to change the culture than we tend to think. You know, it's like if we see a few people around us doing it, then that's a model for us doing something. And it actually takes a relatively few amount of people to be like, oh, that's an acceptable way to be. I can be like that, or whatever it is, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The, the thing you said about the existential need for humans to overcome the tendency to hate each other, that is something that it seems like that's a big part of a lot of this activism that we're seeing is about looking for a bad guy in everything. There's definitely like the social justice rhetoric that there's a bad guy, and it's whatever it is, that you're on the wrong side of their intersectionality matrix. You know, usually you can point to the cishet white guy or whatever, but whatever iteration of that.
Dynamics.
Yeah, the power dynamic. And it is so utterly dehumanizing, and it doesn't offer a way back for that other party, because they're just the archetype of all that is wrong. And to me, it seems like one of the scary things is that the automatic response is to be on the other side of that and fight that, and take that same energy and put it back towards the person who's giving it. And I really believe that what you're saying it makes a lot of sense to me. We really have to build a bridge. We really have to stop that process and stop reacting the way that we're programmed to automatically react to those kind of threats. We have to think with our higher self and with our more rational and long-term interest, and not just take the bait and jump right into the fight.
Yeah, I think to your point, it's like, you know, and I have a section in my book about the you know, social justice kind of dynamics and examining that. I think part of that, I think the thing I see on the conservative side of these kind of issues is like, I think they'd be much more effective highlighting liberal people who have, instead of like forming their own criticisms, which is mainly just speaking to the conservative choir, it's like they'd be much more effective drawing attention to the, you know, people on the left who have criticized these things from a, you know, in a much more liberal speaking way. In the same way, I think that liberals critiquing conservative stuff would be much better suited drawing attention to conservatives who have criticized the more divisive stuff. So I think, being aware of like how we're likely to persuade people, is very important. And that's the thing I see, few people being willing to examine, because there can be an incentive to like, oh, well, I want to score my points against the other side. The emphasis isn't on persuasion. It's on like, I want to show them how stupid they're being, So that's what I come back to, is like, fitting into that, we can work towards our political goals and be more persuasive and respectful. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to go through this with me and to talk about this project and the importance of it. Would you mind giving your links, and where can people find your work?
Yeah, you can check me out. A good place to start would probably be my podcast, which is People Who Read People, it's called, but the website is behavior-podcast.com, and I have links to other things from there, like including to the book, and I have a depolarization Substack. I have probably too many things going on, but yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for having me and letting me share my ideas.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'll put links to everything in the description. So if people want to follow that, they can go find you in those places. Thank you so much, Zach.
Thanks, Leslie.